The Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy is unlike any other state's. Its strategy is unlike any other state's. Its methods and its motivations are unlike any other state's. No other state supports a vast network of proxy terrorist groups. No other state tries to control its neighbors through those proxy networks. No other state uses terror as a tool to expand. No other state feels the end time is so near. No other state is an activist, Twelver, Shiite, Islamic Republic. All too often, Iran is analyzed from either a purely rational, realist point of view or from the other extreme. They are irrational. They are simply the mad ayatollahs. Here, we will be attempting to see their foreign policy as they see it, neither secular nor mad, rather the outcome of a coherent worldview, one that is both fascinating and frightening, and yes, often fanatical, but always with its own rationality, even if that rationality incorporates within it the end of time. There are countless ways to analyze Iran, from the economic to the military, to the regional, to the internal, to the revolutionary, to the totalitarian, and yes, to the religious. Every one of those lenses is useful, but in Iran's case, it seems that the driving force, the organizing logic, if you will, is the theological. But even within the theological, there is a vast amount of nuance. And so, in this video, we are going to be looking at 5 different theological layers which influence how Iran sees itself and the world, and how it functions and acts on the world stage. We'll be looking at Iran on its own terms, taking a deep dive into their theology and avoiding simple generalizations. Each different layer will provide a different lens through which we can understand certain aspects of Iranian foreign policy and Iranian military strategy. And once we understand that layer, we will then dive one level deeper. Of course, even this will necessarily need oversimplification, but it should provide a far richer base for understanding the complexities of the Iranian regime than that which is currently present in both the general and academic discourse in the West. So join me on this journey, which looks past simple explanations and dives deep into the nuances of the Iranian Islamic Republic's belief system. It is truly fascinating, and I hope you will find it fascinating as well. Because only by understanding what motivates their goals can a better understanding of how they will act in the future can be found, and also to see what other potential paths this Iranian regime can take. This is Causality, the news of present symptoms. We provide the diagnosis. My name is Shalom Bal Eretz. I have a background in international relations, political science, sociology, and I have also studied one or two things about theology over the years. On this channel, we take a look behind the scenes to see the reasons why world events happen the way they do. In this video, we will be striving for nuance, both not disregarding the theological and also not looking at the theological as this one-dimensional fanatical project. I am releasing this video alongside another video, which I call an Introduction to Theogeopolitics. There, I will detail my thoughts on how to approach religion in this type of geopolitical analysis. While not strictly necessary, it is recommended to watch that video in order to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of this lens, either before or after watching this video. What is necessary to understand moving forward is that my standard for theogeopolitics isn't simply that religion is involved, but rather that the theology of the religion, and not simply the identity associated with that religion, is what drives events forward. or alternatively, that the theology itself is changed in order to fit the state's interests. The result in either case is that the state's actions and the state's theology support one another. The litmus test that I will keep throughout this video is whether Iran's actions would have been different if they had a different theology. That thought experiment, I think, can really show where it is actually the theology of the regime which drives the actions of the state and where it is something else. This video will take a look at the Iranian Islamic Republic's foreign policy and internal policy from 5 different lenses. First is the Islamic lens. Here we will find the Islamic theology of expanding Islam's influence, defending the world of Islam, but also Iran's goal of gaining leadership in the Islamic world, the Ummah. Second, we will look at the lens of Shiism, how it was an oppressed sect throughout much of its formative history and how that informs its theology, and how the Sunni-Shia dynamic still affects the Iranian worldview. Third, we'll be looking at 12er Shiism. There I will explain the theology surrounding the imamate and the belief in the hidden 12th Imam, the Mahdi, and how the Mahdi is a central pillar in how the Iranian regime views the world. Spoiler, officially in the constitution, the Mahdi is the head of state. Fourth, we'll go even further and look at the specific Iranian strain of 12er Shiism, which was formulated around the Iranian Revolution, which is an activist version where the regime feels that its divine purpose is to clear the path for the Mahdi. And fifth, we will look at the internal divisions within the Iranian regime, where we will find different factions, some viewing the return of the Mahdi in general terms, and some who view that the apocalypse is now, and the Mahdi is on the horizon, and we are in the midst of the war at the end of time. By looking at these 5 different layers and how they interact with one another, we are able to produce a rich picture of the different motivations of the Islamic Republic. Again, this does not mean that there are not other considerations. I have also tried to incorporate most of those considerations within this theory. They all have a place, but here we'll be looking at this from the theological point of view. Because as I say in this channel, every event has 1,000 causes, and in this video, I'm only looking at 5. Also, throughout the video, there will be multiple terms, Islamic terms, and I will try to pronounce them in the Persian way, but I am absolutely positive that I will fail miserably in this. So, my apologies. And now, without further ado, let's begin. Iran is an Islamic Republic. It's right there in the name. And as an Islamic Republic, it feels that its duty is to not only serve the state's interest, but also serve the interests of the Ummah, and to spread Islam, dawah. And this affects how it feels that it should rule internally according to Sharia, and in terms of its foreign policy. We can understand this on 2 levels. First is that it views the creation of an Islamic Republic as a model to be followed for the rest of the Islamic world. And because it is supposed to be a model to be followed, there is added importance and weight to how pure that Islamic society that they make is. Because if it fails in its endeavor, then it will sort of delegitimize political Islam as a whole in a way. And political Islam would find less purchase around the world. And this places a vast amount of additional pressure that the Iranian model will succeed. Iran doesn't seem to be so focused on proselytizing Islam throughout the world. It seems that it has placed most of its focus on trying to gain leadership of the world which is already Islamic. Now, the problem for Iran, which is a topic we will get far more into detail later on, is that it is a Shiite country, and most of the Islamic world is Sunni. But this fact makes that goal that much more seductive. Because if, after a millennia, the oppressed Shia become the leaders of the Islamic world, that is a prize worth working toward, no matter how far-fetched. And this is one of the main reasons behind a lot of their foreign policy, especially the political, monetary, and material support for the Palestinian cause, and especially for Hamas and Islamic Jihad, precisely because they are Sunni. The Iranian regime is able to try and make inroads into the Sunni Arab street by presenting themselves to be the consistently biggest supporters, the most vocal supporters, the most violent supporters of the Palestinians. And they will always contrast that with the wavering support that the Sunni Arab governments give. How successful this has been is up for debate, but I do think it is important to keep this lens in mind as we move further, because the goal of also being the leader of the entire Islamic world often balances out other motivations that Iran has. And so we shift to one of the more important layers in Iranian foreign policy, that of the Shiite lens. Iran is a society dominated by the Shiite religion. I won't dive too much into the split between the Shiites and the Sunnis because most in the West have some notion of this. And if not, there are plenty of references to find out about the righteous caliphs, Ali, and the civil war that continues to this day. But I will touch a little about how this split actually manifests itself. As you know, this split centers around who would be the successor to Muhammad. But to look at it as only a political split is to cheapen it in a very fundamental way, because it is not only about who would be the caliph, but rather, in the Shiite view, it is about the rightful place of the Imam. Generally speaking, the Shiites believe in the sanctity of Ahl-Bayt, the house of the family of Muhammad, or more specifically, the house of the family of Ali, who was married to Fatima, one of Muhammad's daughters. And the Shiites follow an Imam, which has to be one of their descendants. I will get more into the details of this when I look at Twelver Shiism specifically. Here, I'll be looking at things more generally, which is applicable to all Shiite branches, even though Twelver Shiism is by far the most dominant branch today. For Shiites in general, but even more so for the Twelvers, the Imam is considered almost divine. This changes between branches, but the centrality of the Imam cannot be overstated. For example, in Sunni Islam, you have hadiths, and hadiths talk about the life of the Prophet Muhammad, and you can learn different teachings from these hadiths. In Shia Islam, there are also hadiths about the Imams as well, not just the Prophet. And just as you can learn from the hadiths of the Prophet in Shia Islam, you can learn from the hadiths, the stories surrounding the Imams. The reason why I dwell on the importance and the holiness of the Imam in Shiite Islam is to give a little taste about why the Battle of Karbala is so relevant even to this day, and the significance of Ashura, which commemorates that battle. Ashura is one of the main Shiite holidays, and it commemorates the death of Hussein, who was the Imam, according to almost all Shiites. He was the son of Ali and the grandson of the Prophet, and he died in the Battle of Karbala, fighting against what would be called Proto-Sunni. That event echoes through the hearts and minds of the Shiites to this day. It was not only a political battle, but rather they feel that it was the Sunni who betrayed the house of the Prophet. They did not recognize him as the rightful descendant and heir, and they even killed that divine representative on earth. And in the history following that event, the Ahl Bayt were in this oppressed state. The imams of almost every Shiite branch were persecuted by the Sunni majority, save for the rare times where the ruling monarch was a Shiite, the most famous example being the Fatimid Caliphate, Fatimid from Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad. You also might include the state of Alamut, of the assassin fame, which was also Shiite, though both of those were of the Ismaili branch and not the Twelver branch. And then, of course, you have the Safavid dynasty of Persia, where they adopted Twelver Shia Islam as the state religion. And it is from that event that Iran has become almost completely Shiite. For the preceding hundreds of years, the Shiites were an oppressed minority religion. And because of this, they formed strong opinions about the relationship between the oppressor and the oppressed. For the Islamic Republic of Iran, that they are now this major, even powerful Shiite state is a reversal of fortunes which should not be taken lightly. And it also places upon them a duty to improve the positions of Shiites wherever they are found. Doing so is not simply an act of communal solidarity, but it is a way to rectify the disasters of the past, to avenge Karbala, and, spiritually at least, to return Ahl Bayt to its proper place and status. And this directly affects the Iranian foreign policy in multiple ways. Most apparently is that the Iranian proxy network centers mainly around Shiite minorities throughout the Middle East. It is not simply that they share an identity. It is a way for Iran to provide political power for those oppressed Shiite minorities. And by supporting them and by giving them military power, they believe that they are ending for them these years of oppression. They are correcting this historic wrong. And they have done this with Hezbollah in Lebanon, Shiite militias in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and this extends further to armed groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and even into Africa, and also where military aid would be unfeasible, in the Gulf monarchies, for instance, they have used soft power to connect with local Shiite groups with money and support. And this network includes Shiites, which are also not Twelvers. Perhaps most predominantly are the Houthis, which are Zaidi Shiites. I won't go into the differences between Zaidi and Twelver Shiism, and I definitely won't go into the former Assad state and Alawism, which is this whole other can of worms. But the Zaidis differ from the Twelvers in many fundamental ways. Who the Imam is, how they choose the Imam, how they see the end of days, how they see the Mahdi. So it is not as simple as saying, these are Shiites and these are Shiites. They must be on the same page. It is obvious why they are allies, because work had to be done in order to bridge that gap. But that bridge is still easier to cross than that of Hamas, which are Sunni. But keep in mind that that tension between the different branches of Shia will show itself further on. And understand that the Islamic Republic has tried to kind of incorporate the Zaidis into their own Twelver belief system in order to make it work. Something interesting about Iran's foreign policy is that they often avoid using charged Shiite terms when they speak of their struggle against the Sunni majority. This is a rather new phenomenon of the last couple of decades. And the most simplest and forward explanation is that they are trying to stay with that goal that I mentioned in the previous layer of trying to become the leaders of the entire Ummah. So if they were to talk about their struggle as Shiites versus Sunnis, that would exacerbate the tension between the two, and they would be less palatable to the Sunni street. Instead, they lean heavily on concepts of mustadafin against the mustakbarin, the oppressed versus the arrogant. This is the way that they talk about the Sunni regimes, which the arrogant also applies to the West. And that will be a bigger part of the video later on. But in this way, they can structure their antagonism towards the Sunni regimes as a struggle against the arrogant, not necessarily because they are Sunni. This mask, though thin, serves to make them a little bit more palatable to the Sunni street by not putting the spotlight on the sectarian aspect. And this brings me to another interesting aspect of Iranian foreign policy, which stems from this theology of the oppressed versus the arrogant, the oppressor. Because after the revolution, they realized that it actually dovetails quite nicely with anti-imperialism and anti-colonial rhetoric. And so, after the revolution, the Islamic Republic didn't have to do much in order to adapt its theology to appeal to non-Muslim oppressed societies around the world and to position itself as a champion against imperialism, colonialism, and the West. And this could be done not simply cynically, but also as a way to promote this sort of cosmic justice. And they can do this in a way that is actually kind of true to their own theological beliefs. The oppressor versus oppressed language also fits into modern-day critical theory, what can be colloquially referred to as wokeism. That is to say that while much maligned, there are actually some aspects of this red-green alliance which isn't something totally ideologically abhorrent. Of course, the other details in Iranian theology, there is a huge chasm between what they believe and what Western progressive values teach. But it is important to note that in certain areas, there is in fact actual overlap. Now, when looking at how this Shia layer affects them and their foreign policy, I think a lot of it is pretty clear. But there could be the argument made that a lot of this can be viewed as empire building that is due to a shared identity rather than the theological aspects of the Shiite religion. I would make two arguments to say why it is the theology itself. One is that it is not hard to argue that the longevity and resilience of that connection between different Shiite groups over more than 1,000 years is something much easier to accomplish with religion than any other identity. But besides for that, I think that the connection between the theology becomes clearer if you flip the perspective and you look at the proxy's point of view. There is a reason why multiple proxies are called Hezbollah, the party of God. When Iran appeals to them, they are making a religious appeal. They are making an appeal for these groups to attain a divine calling. And I don't know if this religious aspect wasn't part of it, if you would have such ready acceptance by groups around the Middle East to submit to this foreign state in order to foment a rebellion. I also don't know if that connection would be resilient when Iran has had trouble in paying those dues. Case in point that even though Iran seems to be more than willing to give the same sort of material support to non-Shiites while using the oppressor against the oppressed language, it really is only with Hamas and Islamic Jihad that they have succeeded. And there are plenty of non-Shiite minority groups around the world, which I'm sure Iran would love to make inroads with. Contrast that to the ease with which they make inroads into every Shiite community they have tried. I don't think this would have been so achievable without the religious aspect. To understand more about the religious aspect, though, we do have to dive deeper. Up to now, with layer 1 and 2, we haven't strayed that far from what is usually thought of when looking at the Iranian regime. But next, in layer 3, we will be touching on some, frankly, fascinating material which I don't think is known enough in the West. The Islamic Republic is 12er Shiite. I want to briefly talk about what that means, because it is very important to understand Twelver theology before moving on to how this applies to the Iranian state. I truly believe that to understand the Iranian regime, we have to understand their relationship and outlook surrounding the Mahdi. As I previously said, in Shiite Islam, the Imam is immensely important. This is especially true in Twelver Shiite Islam. Twelvers believe that the Imam is infallible. He has a direct line of contact with God. He has supernatural knowledge. His followers don't need to figure things out for themselves, because if you don't know what God wants, you can simply ask the Imam. Except for the fact that the current Imam, who is still called the Imam of our time, has been hidden for over 1,000 years. This means that he is not quite available for regular Q&A. In Twelver thought, there was a line of 12 Imams, the last of which were living under house arrest in Iraq under the Abbasid Caliphate. The belief is the 11th Imam hid from the authorities the fact that he had a son. Remember, according to them, the imamate passes from father to son. There are others who are not Twelver who would simply say that the 11th Imam simply did not have a son, ending the line. But since we are looking at this from the view of the Islamic Republic, then according to Twelver Islam, he most certainly did have a son. There are even stories that his wife showed no signs of pregnancy until right before the 12th Imam was born, in order to hide the fact of his existence. Because since all the Imams were oppressed, then only by hiding him could he avoid that oppression. And those same stories, even more wondrously, report that right after birth he was able to talk, and aptly it relates that his first words were to quote a surah from the Quran. And we want to confer favor upon those who were oppressed in the land. This 12th Imam was promptly hidden away by his father. And it is this 12th Imam who they believe is the promised, prophesied Mahdi, the Messiah-like figure who will reveal himself at the end of days, where he is supposed to carry out a whole lot of end-of-days stuff, similar to what can be found in Revelations. When the 11th Imam died, when this 12th Imam was 5, he actually became the 12th Imam. But he remained hidden. The first 70 years is called the minor occultation. During this time, he supposedly had emissaries through which he could indirectly engage the world. He could answer questions and he could relate to his followers. But after 70 years, he no longer had any emissaries, and he was completely hidden, with no engagement and no contact whatsoever with the world. This is what is called the Great Occultation. And that Great Occultation, they believe, continues to this very day, which is why he's still called the Imam of our time. He is still around on earth. They believe alongside this doctrine is the doctrine of Hujjah, the belief that the world cannot exist for a second without a divine proof on earth. And who is that divine proof? The 12th Imam. Therefore, the 12th Imam has to be still here, because if he was not still here, there would be no Hujjah, and the world couldn't exist. This has been the state of affairs for the last 1,000 years. Twelvers believe that he is simply alive on earth, but hidden. And the Twelvers wait for the day where he will reveal himself. It is said that when the Mahdi comes, he will put order to the affairs of the world and create a just and righteous world. Also, Jesus comes back, and they preach together, but the Mahdi leads the sermons, and Jesus stands behind him. And together, they kind of form this dynamic duo, and they fight the forces of evil, and they defeat the forces of evil, and Jesus even dies in his final act. While not quite official, it's kind of to show the Christians that, hey, look, Jesus, he's mortal. After this, the Mahdi is supposed to rule Earth for an extended period of time. And while during this period the Earth isn't devoid of problems, it is generally considered a time of wonders. Now the prophecy continues to what happens after the Mahdi dies and other imams return until the very, very, very end of time, but that is a rough sketch of what is relevant to us today. Now, for those familiar with different messianic movements in other religions, this is your basic messianic fare. But I believe there are a few differences in 12er Shiite eschatology, the end-of-time belief, as opposed to other end-of-time beliefs in other religions. And that affects how practitioners associate themselves with it. One is that the Mahdi is already here, walking around on earth. He's only hidden. I think this kind of lends itself to a sort of immediacy that is more clear and present than what is in Jewish messianic circles or in Christian second coming circles. As opposed to a vague Messiah where you don't know where he is, when he'll be born, when he will come, or Jesus, which is not on earth, this Mahdi has a name. He was already born. He's already here on earth. He is simply waiting to reveal himself because he never died. Second is that the prophecies surrounding the events, both preceding and during the return of the Mahdi, are oddly specific for eschatological literature. Most of the time, prophecy about the end of days is rather vague in most religions. But in the writings on the Mahdi, things are written out at such a high resolution. Even the speech that he gives is already written. Even how he leans to one side when he talks, and much, much more. It is laid out that there will be this Sufyani who rules in Syria from Damascus. It says that he will send an army down to the Mahdi, and that this army will be swallowed up at a specific point in Arabia between Mecca and Medina. It says that there will be this Yemeni who raises the flag of the true believer, and that he will be the most righteous. And it says that there will be another army with black banners that comes from Khorasan. There will be one event after another, and it will happen on this day of the year. All of these different details as to how the events at the end of time happens are there to a far greater extent than what I at least am familiar with in other eschatological literature. I think that by virtue of having these rich details of how things will actually happen, it lends itself to be scrutinized more by its followers. This is so much so that there is an actual prohibition called tatbik, where it is forbidden to say, this event is that sign, and this event is that sign. Partly because the temptation is so great. Though, as we will see, this isn't strictly followed anymore by some. Now, there are also more general signs of the time, such as that the end of time will be a time of arrogance, and that the arrogant will rule the world. And these more general signs of the time is what you can find parallels with in other messianic beliefs. But in terms of the Mahdi itself, there is such clear and specific instructions that if you are a follower, you almost can't help but keep an eye out for these events to unfold. Now, the idea of the Mahdi exists in wider Islam, both in Shiism and also in Sunni Islam, though this differs depending upon the school, and different scholars in Sunni Islam might de-emphasize it. It also isn't actually mentioned in the Quran, but only in the Hadith. But for 12er Shias, this is a cornerstone part of their entire belief system, because their belief system is built about their connection with the Imam, and the Imam is currently not to be found. There is a profound irony there. If the defining feature of your sect is the presence of a divine, infallible guide who can answer all of your questions, what happens when that guide is no longer there? Practically, after the Great Occultation started, 12er Shiism had to build their own school of law similar to that of other Muslims, and this became the Jafari school of law. Interestingly, that school of law is remarkably similar to other Sunni schools of law, even though the theology which backs it up is different. Almost all of the laws are the same, besides minor details. But in the absence of the Imam, there was another development that happened over the centuries, and that was the rise in the importance of the scholar. An idea was formed that when the Imam cannot be reached, there can be a scholar which is there in his stead. Not as an Imam, but the appointed scholar is considered to be a representative of the Imam. They are temporary placeholders for the divine authority that is physically absent but legally ever present. Remember this, because this becomes very important later on. Now, I will save the most important ways that this affects foreign policy for the next layer, where we see this activist variant of the Islamic Republic. But here, I will take a look at the counterfactual to understand that traditionally, 12er beliefs promoted non-involvement with politics and global affairs. This is because the Imam isn't present, and only the Imam can wield legitimate political power on earth. So if he is not present, you simply have to wait for him. This is important to understand the ever-present tension of a theocratic regime which constantly has to reconcile the fact that while leaning on religion for legitimacy, for most of its history, that very religion would never have allowed for the type of state they have created until it was reinterpreted by Khomeini. They have to reconcile the fact that one of the most, if not the most, prominent living scholar of that religion, the Grand Ayatollah al-Sistani, who lives in Iraq, not Iran, believes that the Iranian interpretation is wrong. That school of thought, which is now called Quietism, was actually, before the Iranian Revolution, simply called 12er Shiism. And that school of thought sustains that the Mahdi will come when he will come, and that you should not try to hurry him on, and that any form of rule on earth before the Mahdis is inherently corrupt. This has to be kept in mind as we go through the final sections. For the Iranian regime, for the true believers, failure of the Iranian project would mean that Quietism is correct. It would mean that their theology, not just their policy, is wrong. It would mean that they would have to relook their entire belief structure. And you don't have to be a psychologist to understand how cognitive dissonance works and how this can affect the motivations of the true believers today. To truly understand the theology of the Islamic Republic of Iran, we have to understand Khomeini and the Iranian Revolution. Because this was not just a political revolution. This was a religious revolution, where a new form of 12er theology was created. They might claim that precursors of this thought existed beforehand, but nothing should detract from understanding how massive a shift this really was. They created activist 12er ideology, because those following this form now become called activist, and those who did not follow this novel form became to be called quietist. Quietist theology would not have allowed for a theocratic regime to exist, so they had to change the theology in order to make a theocratic regime not only possible, but wanted and needed and necessary. The activist branch feels that it needs to help the Mahdi. What does this mean? This means that instead of simply waiting for the Mahdi to return, you need to actively bring about his return. You need to clear the way for the Mahdi, which means you need to build a state for the Mahdi. In the constitution of the Islamic Republic, the head of state is the Imam of our time, the Mahdi. It is only until he returns that the supreme leader rules in his stead. The whole institution was built for him. And so the state they built needs to be built in a way which suits him. So it needs to be pure. And when that state builds an army, when it builds the Revolutionary Guard, they are building an army fit for the Mahdi. It is that Mahdi's army which was prophesied for at the end of days. And that means that in order to make the path of the Mahdi easier, they must fight the enemies of the Mahdi, here and now. One of the most novel ideas that they use to make this work is the idea of Velayat al-Faqih, the rule of the scholar. Here, they take that previously mentioned role that the scholar had as a representative of the Mahdi, what was previously only for religious matters, and they add to that he is a representative of the Mahdi also in political matters. Just as the Imam is the spiritual and political head of the people, the scholar becomes the spiritual and political head of the people. Now, scholars previously have had political influence during the Safavid and later dynasties, but they were never heads of state. And so for the Iranians, the supreme leader needs to be this worthy scholar. Originally, he had to have had the rank of Grand Ayatollah, which Khomeini was. But, interestingly, Mujtaba Khamenei is not a Grand Ayatollah, and he was made supreme leader. And perhaps more interestingly, his father Ali Khamenei also wasn't a Grand Ayatollah when he was made supreme leader. They actually changed the constitution for Khamenei to allow him to become supreme leader. And only afterwards did they quickly arrange for him to attain that exalted rank of Grand Ayatollah. If Mujtaba stays in his role as supreme leader, no doubt this would also be accompanied by a miraculous leap in his esoteric and religious knowledge, and he will surpass all of his elders, and he will also become a Grand Ayatollah in quick time. The role of the supreme leader and the rule of the scholar was further solidified by Khamenei, the father, because it was under him that this became much more of a totalitarian system. Because in his thought, if he is the representative of the Imam on earth, and he is the head of state, then any disobedience to the state, any disobedience to him, is disobedience to the Imam. It is sacrilege. It is a sin. And so it has to be dealt with accordingly. And so this state fit for the Mahdi has the enemies of the Mahdi. And who are the enemies of the Mahdi? They are the arrogant. They are the great Satan and the little Satan. Now, most of you have heard this term before, but I think most people view it as like this broad insult. But in fact, this is a theological description. They are saying that you are the enemy of the Mahdi. You are the arrogant. In the prophecies, it is the arrogant who will rule the world before the Mahdi, and it is the arrogant who will need to be destroyed. The great Satan, He is the cause of all that is bad in the world. Why Satan? Because in Islam, as in other religions, Satan is a deceiver, a corrupter. And just as Satan deceives and corrupts, the West deceives and corrupts the world with its Western culture and values. They don't think the US is bad because it meddles in the Middle East. No. The US is bad because it is in fact the great Satan. And it meddles in the Middle East because obviously that is what the great Satan would do. Meaning that the US is not bad because of the bad things they do. You do bad things because you are bad. You promote democracy. You promote liberal ideas. You promote things which are against Islam. You are corrupting society with those liberal and democratic values. You are the great Satan. And then the Iranian people revolt in the streets. Is this because the regime is bad? Is this because the Iranian people have valid grievances? No. They believe that this is because they were corrupted by the great Satan. And they're going out into the streets. They're rising up against the state of the Mahdi, the supreme leader, the representative of the Mahdi. That can only be a sign of corruption, of spiritual corruption. And accordingly, they need to be put down by any means necessary. Not only can they be put down brutally, but according to them, if they are working against the rule of the divine representative on earth, the only correct option for the regime is to be as brutal and as uncompromising as possible, because anything else would be to fail in their religious duty. The state is not there to serve the people. The state is there to serve the messianic figure of the Mahdi. The IRGC is not there to serve the people. It is there to clear a path for the end of days. To do this, it needs to organize all the Shiites, the righteous, under the banner of the Mahdi. It needs to pour money into Hezbollah, so they are in place to fight Sufyani when he arrives in Syria. And they will need to support the Houthis, who will be the Yemeni, the most righteous, and the vanguard of the Mahdi. And they will need to gather all the different Shiite around the world, so they will be prepared and ready to take part in the glorious return of the Mahdi. But it doesn't stop there. It actually explains the strategy of the axis of resistance, because they believe the enemies of the Mahdi are the arrogant. And they also know from scripture how to defeat the arrogant, because the arrogant are weak. The arrogant cannot withstand pain. The arrogant are decadent. In other words, the arrogant succumb to terrorism. The strategy of terrorism is designed so that more powerful states concede defeat because it simply isn't worth the pain to pursue victory. This understanding, this belief that the West is weak, doesn't simply come from prophecy, but it has been borne out throughout the decades by the West's own actions. When the West looks more to the price of oil on the closing of the Strait of Hormuz than their own interests, they see that the West is weak. They see that the West has allowed itself to be blackmailed by the IRGC. When the West pulls out because of terror attacks, when the West retreats from different areas, they see the arrogant avoiding pain. the arrogant being weak. They see the arrogant bending to the will of the Islamic Republic, the Shiite militias, the Houthis, Hezbollah. They count on the fact that if given a choice between undergoing short-term pain or abandoning their long-term interests, the West will always choose to avoid their short-term pain. And this is the organizing logic behind much of Iran's strategy. That if you find the right levers which will cause the West pain, then Iran can continue to build and strengthen the state for the Mahdi and clear the way for the Mahdi's return. And this explains how the axis of resistance works. Every part is calculated to cause pain to Iran's enemies, not to defeat them militarily. They didn't focus on building their conventional military. Instead, they focused on funding the IRGC, whose main weaponry consists of ballistic missiles, of drones, and other systems which are there to disrupt and cause pain. But they are of limited value in actually defeating an enemy, of taking territory. The same thing goes for their various proxies. Though it's important to remember that since activist twelverism was an Iranian recent invention, before they could use the proxies in this integrated way, they also essentially had to convert them to this school of thought. And they did this by actively funding schools and bringing in scholars to Iran and making it that slowly, all the different scholars leading the various Shiite communities around the world become not only activists in their theology, but they also would accept the Velayat al-Fiqh, the leadership of the supreme leader of Iran, as the rule of the scholar. And when they do that, then it means they must obey him, because he is the representative of the Mahdi on earth. And so they built out this proxy network. They funded different Shiite groups with money. They funded them with arms until it was strong enough not to win, but to cause pain. But with this proxy network, they also did something else, not only to fight against the West, but they also conducted what we might call state capture. After building up the forces of a Shiite minority in different states, they then try to take control of that state. In this way, Lebanon, until very recently, was almost completely controlled by Hezbollah. Iraq is still in the thralls of the PMFs, and in multiple other countries you can find militias whose loyalty leads to Iran and not to the state which they are ostensibly governed by, because they realize that as long as a state knew or learned that the militia inside of it can cause it a vast amount of pain, then they could be coerced into giving them everything they wanted. Access, funding, power. How was this possible? Well, to them, it was possible because these were Sunni regimes. They are the arrogant, and so they too can be coerced. And once they had all the proxies all over the Middle East, they could essentially extort more and more countries under the threat of pain. Each proxy brought its own advantages. The PMFs in Iraq were not only a good buffer for the Iranian regime, they also brought in money, and they could be easily deployed to neighboring countries if the need arose. Hezbollah could keep Israel in check through its missile capabilities. Assad's Syria is a little different because it was an actual state and not simply a militia, but it was still there and provided a land bridge that connected the entire empire together and to the Mediterranean. The Houthis could pester the Saudis, and they could control the Red Sea, similar to the way Iran sought to control the Strait of Hormuz, because this was their additional strategy. They used control of straits in the same way that they used terrorism, because if you can fire on civilian ships, you can essentially block all commercial traffic. And because the West and the insurance companies of the West don't want pain, just the threat will block traffic, and that blocked traffic will cause immense pain. And when the entire West is in pain, they will capitulate because they are weak, because they are arrogant. And so they built out what was essentially a vast extortion network, always banking that no one would oppose them because of the short-term pain they could always cause. And that short-term pain would be too high. And this was not simply a military assertion. This was based on their theology. Interestingly, this is actually similar to that same strategy practiced by the assassins of Alamut, who were also Shiite, though not Twelver. Of course, the major prize for the regime would have to been getting a nuclear bomb. With a nuclear bomb, the level of extortion they would have been able to undertake would have dwarfed anything that they have been able to do up until that point. I am sure that they imagined how the arrogant would quickly buckle before them, and how they would be free to pave the way for the Mahdi in whichever way they pleased. They would become untouchable, and perhaps the Mahdi himself would enjoy having nukes at his disposal when he takes charge. The other side to the strategy is not only that the West can take pain, but they also built their strategy that they, the righteous, could take pain, because they view that any pain they go through is a cleansing pain. It is a pain that purifies. And so, sanctions, economic damage, anything else that the West could do wouldn't force them to concede. Rather, it would strengthen their resolve, because they, in their eyes, are not weak. They can take pain. This strategy worked for decades, but it has started to fail spectacularly in the last few years. To understand why, I think it rests on two failures. One was that they based their strategy on theology, and they also included within that strategy proxies who were not of the same theology. As mentioned, Hamas are not even Shiite. And so their view of the apocalypse is very different. They might have apocalyptic views, but it is a very different apocalyptic outlook. And because they don't accept the rule of the scholar, they are much harder to control, because their vision of the future doesn't need to play nicely with Iran's. Assad's regime was Alawite, which means it is very different than regular Shiite or even Sunni Islam. So while they were strategic partners, and while they had the label of Shiite by the Iranians for convenience sake, I don't think the theology was there binding them. And even the Houthis are not Twelver Shiites. So the Imam isn't necessarily the hidden Imam of the Twelver religion. And they also have the prophecy that it's the Yamani who raises the banner and the Yamani who leads. So if it is the Yamani who leads, why should they take orders from Tehran? Two is that having a strategy based on pain doesn't work once the threat becomes existential. And that's the mistake they made with Israel. By making the threat existential and by having a proxy go through with an act which does not allow to simply avoid pain because the threat is so clearly existential, then their entire system was laid bare to the weakness that it could not defeat their enemies, it could only cause them pain. And once their enemies were able to simply take that pain, there was no stopping their entire regional strategy from collapsing. Now, let's dive one level deeper. The fifth layer is all about internal factional politics in Iran. And we will look at these internal factions through how these factions handle some of the darkest, most violent prophecies surrounding the coming of the Mahdi. Because there are prophecies, hadiths, about the coming of the Mahdi, which are not quite pleasant. There are hadiths about a red death of global war and a white death of plague. And these two events will wipe out 5 out of every 7 people on earth. There is apocalyptic chaos. There is a bloodbath. There are specific signs. And how different factions look at these different events and the general coming of the Mahdi says a lot about where they land in terms of the regime. On one side of the spectrum, inside Iran, you still have quietists. And while they don't have much say in the Iranian regime, they would view these prophecies with strict caution. They would see it more allegorical. They explicitly forbid tatbik, for looking at modern-day events and trying to ascribe them ancient prophecy. So these texts are more divine mysteries. They're not to be taken literal. And they're not to have an impact on how you live your day-to-day life. The establishment would view these prophecies through a geopolitical lens. They would understand that there is this impending apocalypse, and they need to arm and be ready for it. And that this apocalypse will be brought about by the arrogant forces in the world, so they also need a proxy network to prepare for it. And so they'll build the Revolutionary Guard, and they'll organize the followers for that day. And they'll want to defeat the enemies, these broad enemies, to make it easier to pave the way for the Mahdi. But they also forbid tatbik. And they won't get into particulars about what state is what and when the Mahdi will return. And then there is a more particularist faction, one for whom the end of time is known, and that time is now. We are now in the time of the coming of the Mahdi. They believe we have moved beyond the stage of simply preparing for his arrival in general terms. But the time has come to raise the banner of the Mahdi. Some in the regime will call them Hujjatiyya, even though this is largely incorrect, and they use it in order to associate them with a discredited and banned group from the 80s, even though there are huge theological differences. Or they will simply call them Janyane Inhirafi, the deviant current, because they view them as a current which is gone astray from what should be. But they themselves would probably call themselves simply Zaman Sazan, the way pavers. Ahmadinejad, most people say, was associated with this school of thought, often referring to the Mahdi. And while I don't want to make any claims about who exactly believes this and who doesn't believe this, I frankly don't think anybody actually knows, because officially this is not allowed. There are many claims, however, that there are many people in different positions of power, and they often include within this high members of the IRGC who come from this school of thought. There have even been murmurings that perhaps Mujtaba Khamenei is from this school of thought as well. But again, that is simply not knowable at the moment. But this school engages in tatbik. They believe that they are actually fighting the Mahdi's war as we speak, that they are in a holy war against the great Satan. During the Syrian civil war, they didn't just see a geopolitical conflict. They proclaimed that the anti-regime forces were the literal army of the Sufyani. For this group, the prophesied red death of wars isn't something in the future. It is the bloodshed we see in the wars around us. It can even be the bloodshed of the protesters who died by their hands. The US is not only the great Satan, but it can also be identified with Dajjal, the great deceiver, who is this end boss in the theology of the apocalypse. It is that Dajjal who is the Antichrist that Jesus and the Mahdi defeat together. And they believe that by engaging in these apocalyptic conflicts, they are helping to serve as the catalyst for the end of times. To them, violence isn't a tragedy to be avoided. It is the brutal, necessary birth pangs of the Mahdi's return which was foretold, and they are more than willing to hasten that violence and therefore hasten the Mahdi's return. There is even to be said a more extreme group. Even though this might simply be accusations by more moderate people trying to discredit others. But some will claim that there are groups in Iran, even groups with power, who believe that in prophecy the Mahdi will come either when everything is prepared or when everything is at a loss. So paradoxically, if you were to hasten the destruction of the Islamic Republic, then you would simultaneously hasten the arrival of the Mahdi in order to save it. I won't dwell too much on that faction because its implications are pretty clear, but it is also completely unknown how prevalent or non-prevalent that faction might be. What comes from this understanding is that we're not simply talking about a unified regime, and that there might be factions with different theological beliefs, which affect how they view foreign policy and how they view strategy and how they view war. One of the biggest effects of this belief is that if you believe that you are currently in an apocalyptic war, then that changes your entire cost-benefit analysis. Because you are no longer playing a game where you judge your actions as to whether it gives you a positive advantage or a negative advantage at the end of the war. Whether you come out on top economically or if it hurt economically. Whether you would rather have sanctions and a nuclear program or no sanctions and not have a nuclear program. Instead, if the conflict is the apocalypse, then you are fighting the forces of evil. You either beat the forces of evil or you lose to the forces of evil. The stakes are cosmic. And not only that, when you win, the Mahdi comes. In regular game theory, you might make a simple game where losing a war might be like a -10 and winning a war would be a +10. But here, if you bring about the Mahdi, then that's a plus infinity. That's an automatic win state until the end of time. That's about bringing about a world of wonders and of plenty. And that needs to be kept in mind when talking about rationality in an Iranian state. It is too easy to say that an actor is either rational or irrational, but an actor can also be rational within its own frame of reference, which to an outsider might look completely irrational. But that isn't the only place where rationality has a part in the Iranian state. Because much like a religious individual who goes to the hospital even though he believes that God is who decides who lives and who dies, a religious state believes that its actions are important, its power is important, the state is important, will have to act rationally in order to gain more power, to be a stronger state. And this is where within the theogeopolitics, you can incorporate all other theories of geopolitics, of international relations. Because when running the state of the Mahdi, you still want to give the Mahdi a strong state. And so that means you will try to do economic policy which strengthens the state. You will want to have an army which protects the state. You will want to improve its geopolitical standing among the world. you will sometimes drink from the poisoned chalice. You might make a hard decision which might be a little impure, but pragmatically, it increases the chances of state survival. It increases the chances that the state will be strong enough to pave the way for the Mahdi. And so when you look back into the past about these pragmatic actions that the regime has taken, most of them need to be framed as such. The practitioners were believers in the state of the Mahdi, but they realized that sometimes pragmatism, sometimes regular realist thought takes precedent over the theological in order that the goals of the theological can be realized. And that is my take on Iran. It is a rational actor, but the stakes that it is playing for are completely different stakes than what the West is playing for. And this goes for the entire regime, not just the extreme factions. They are playing for end-of-day salvation. They are playing for the Mahdi. They are playing for what they truly believe is peace on earth and this amazing future. Killing protesters is an act of purification. Terrorism is proving that the West is arrogant and weak. Dying is simply becoming a martyr to the highest cause imaginable. You strive that your faction wins in Iran so that Iran can be on the correct path in your vision. You strive that that path clears a way for the Mahdi by defeating his enemies and by gathering his followers under your banner. You strive to uphold the Mahdi's will, to wait for the 12th Imam to return, and to convince all others of its truth. You strive to fight against the Sunni arrogant regimes, to reverse millennia-long oppression throughout the Middle East, to avenge Karbala. You strive to lead the entire Ummah under a righteous cause, to be a light of political Islam that other Muslim nations can copy. You strive to have your theology not just sit in books, but to be part of your statecraft. Of course, no one can look into the hearts of those who lead the regime and see what they really believe. And there are no lack of those who would say that they are simply led by corruption and not piety. On this, I say two things. One is that to think the two were mutually exclusive is naive. And even if so, the language of the state is religion, is theology. And whether this is followed out of belief or convenience is functionally irrelevant as long as the language of the regime is dominant and ever-present. Where it can become relevant is how individuals like this, whether they be corrupt or not true believers, will act when the regime is in danger. Whether they will double down or whether they will abandon it. Because if you are a true believer, then abandoning it is not simply a political act. It doesn't simply have material cost. It isn't simply an act for how that looks in society, but it is an act which will determine your eternal reward. You might have noticed that I did not include in this analysis secular Iranians. This is because when judging the state, you have to look at those in power. And those in power at the moment are not secular Iranians. But of course, what happens on the street and what the vast populace wants is really important as to whether those in power stay in power in the future. I think by understanding these 5 different levels of Iranian foreign policy through different theological lenses, we can get a much clearer understanding of the many different ways that Iran functions. But after all that, what did we actually learn from this? I think by identifying Iran and its strategy as that of a messianic movement, we can learn from failed messianic movements of the past. When messianic movements become too caught up with their own invincibility, which I think is what has happened with Iran, then there really are two options. Either they lose and are almost destroyed, or the Messiah actually comes and fixes all the world's ills. And as of yet, that hasn't happened. It might really be that only through loss can that fever dream of messianic hysteria loosen its hold. True, no matter how great the loss, there will always be those who will disregard it, who will blame it on the impure among themselves, or claim that if only this or that were different, then the Mahdi would have returned. But it might, just might, open a path for many to be de-radicalized. And looking forward into Iran's future, losing either this war or the next could provide that path forward toward de-radicalization. Because what would that look like? If we look at the theology, then we can understand how that might actually play out. Because if they lose in a tangible way, then the activist view of 12er Shiite Islam breaks. Because the Islamic Republic is this vehicle for paving the way for the Mahdi. And that is a core part of the belief. And if the Islamic Republic is shown to be a failure, if it is shown that it did not pave the way and the Mahdi did not return and it has already failed, then perhaps many religious Shiite in Iran will naturally drift back to the quietist school. I wouldn't take this for granted because 50 years is a long time to ingrain a belief system. I would also highly doubt that there would be no more activist 12ers around, but perhaps their activism could become something less militant in nature. Of course, the other option is that the defeat of the Islamic Republic would be seen as a repeat of Karbala, another indignity, another historic loss which needs to be revenged. So there's also that possibility. As we saw in the past, the Iranian regime is more than capable of making pragmatic choices to ensure its survival in order to fight another day. But even if a sort of deal like that is made, the West should understand that they will be constantly looking for new opportunities to rebuild that power and to defeat the enemies of the Mahdi. This analysis does not predict the future. There are too many variables and unknowns for that. And as we have seen, the theology itself can change and shift. I have mainly tried to show how this theology has shaped the past. I don't know when you're watching this video. Perhaps you are watching this at a future date, where Iran is a thriving democracy. And this video is simply an historical retrospective at a theology that once was. Or, of course, the Mahdi could return. But I, for one, am not holding my breath. There are further nuances which I have left out. Different schools within Iran, the differences between Qom and Mashhad, secret societies, and more. But in this video, I tried to balance deep nuance with clarity. And hopefully that balance was struck. In the description, you can find some different sources where this topic can be approached from different angles. I also have a Patreon where I have free articles and videos which wouldn't help the YouTube algorithm, and also some content behind a paywall where I produce bonus videos about different topics and different videos that I made, including this one. As always, if the paywall is too high, send me an email and I'll gift you a free subscription. This has been Causality. The news explores the symptoms, we provide the diagnosis. Until next time, take care.